Alrighty, history fans, welcome to another exciting, life-affirming edition of History 20, and welcome to the second part of our two-part look at the World War I era. In our most recent lecture, we examined the causes of World War I, and there were many, and the course of the war, how the war became a stalemate, how it led to the death of millions of soldiers and civilians, how it rocked the psyche of human beings around the globe who had hoped for prosperity, opportunity, put their faith in reason, rationality, and science in the early 20th century. And then we examined 1917 as a key year in the course of the war, where many important turning points would take place. The U.S. entering the war on the side of the Entente powers, the Russian Revolution, and the early exit from the war by Russia, and divisions within Germany, mutiny and desertion as the war went on, as many in the soldiering classes became convinced that the people leading them were incompetent and responsible for the absolute death and destruction the war wrought. And as a result, by November of 1918, Germany was eager to end the madness, and it called for an armistice. So that summarizes what we examined in our very first lecture on the World War I era. Here today, we're going to turn our attention to the impact of the war on the nations involved, what was going on in the domestic scene in regards to the nations involved, and we'll offer some summary points, some summary examples of some of that domestic impact, the impact of the war at home on the nations involved. It was a total war. It was an all-consuming war. And we'll, in just a moment, talk about the impacts of the war at home upon people who were hundreds, thousands of miles away. And then, in the latter part of this lecture, we'll talk about the very end of the war, the Paris Peace Conference, that marks the effort to establish a now post-World War I order, and the effects and aftermath of World War I. So after listening to these two lectures, you should know the causes of the war, the course of the war, the impact of the war on the nations involved, and finally the end and aftermath of the war. Things to be mindful of, I don't know, just in case some jerk asks you about that on an exam coming soon. So let's begin our second look at World War I. Let's take a look at the domestic impact, the end of the war, its aftermath. Buckle up, we're about to dive into our second lecture here on the World War I era. Let's begin our second look at the World War I era by recounting some impacts, some developments within nations involved in the war, what we can describe as the domestic impact of World War I, the impact of the war on the nations involved, the impact of the war on civilian populations, on the economies and political scenes and cultures of those nations involved in the war. In World War I, the nations involved, industrial nations, many of whom had gone through liberal revolutions in the 19th century and established liberal constitutions in the way that we described in our first lecture, complete with strong executives, presidents, prime ministers, who had the power to marshal disciplinary force, the force of the state to suppress potential internal dissent. Those nations were the nations involved in World War I. They were these liberal nations transformed by liberal revolutions. They were modern nation states. They created constitutions. Those are the nations involved in World War I. And as a result, during World War I, those nations saw that executive role within their political structure, that executive role, the president, the prime minister, greatly aggrandized their power, because war often allows those in charge of the military, those in charge of the coercive power of the state, the disciplinary element of the state, the military, the police. War often allows those executives who have that power ordained to them in the Constitution, like in the United States, where the United States Constitution declares the president commander-in-chief. Those figures, those presidents, those prime ministers, in times of war, tend to aggrandize their power because it's seen as a great crisis. The homeland, these nations are imperiled, and as a result, there's a moment by which the executive can assume greater power in this role as guardian, defender of the state and the nation. And so in Great Britain, in France, the United States, we see the presidents, the prime ministers, those in those executive roles expand their power or use the war, the crisis of the war, to make greater claims to power. This also is related to the way in which nationalism is so key to the onset of World War I. It's one of those big macro causes we enunciated in our first lecture. There's this patriotism, there's this chest-thumping enthusiasm for war, war, war. We're the German people, we're the members of the great British nation. And so people rally around their government, they rally around their leader, they feel themselves endangered, imperiled, particularly in a war that goes on for so long and makes such a demand on the population. And so there's this hope that if we trust our leader, he will achieve great victory. And so there's an instrumental reason why executives tend to aggrandize their power during war. The constitutions upon which they govern with often concentrate power of the military in the hands of presidents, prime ministers, chancellors, the executives in the government of these nations involved. And then there's a cultural, social reason. It's a time of crisis, it's a time of animosity, it's a time of rivalry, and the civilian populations of these nations want to win. They want that chest-thumping, flag-waving moment of victory. They feel endangered, imperiled, and so they tend to go along with this effort by executives and presidents to claim greater power in the name of security, in the name of victory, in the name of securing for the nation its glory through victory. So one of the impacts that you see in most, if not all, the nations involved, Germany, Japan, the United States, France, greater and greater power claimed by the executive branches of these respective governments. World War I was a great boon to certain elements of the economies of those nations involved. So in our first bullet point, when we talked about the greater power claimed by executives, we tacked back to one of those causes of the war, nationalism. One of the other causes, of course, of World War I, industrialization, the quest for markets, the effort to control scarce resources. These nations involved are nations that have rapidly industrialized, are in the throes and thickets of the Industrial Revolution, and are on a path towards collision as a result in World War I as they compete for scarce resources. So again, we already know that the nations involved in World War I are nations with industrial economies, and that element of their economy, the industrial heart of their economy, really benefits. World War I helped to accelerate industrialization. It helped to aggrandize and amplify the wealth and power of industrialists. It really helped to push these economies that had been transitioning towards industrialization away from agriculture fully along that path. And so certainly the munitions industry, those who make rifles and cannons, benefited from World War I. Steel, oil, all of these materials necessary for the war effort benefited greatly. So this aggrandized the wealth and power of certain industrialists. It consolidated greater control and power. It helped to, again, further accelerate a shift from agriculture to industry in these industrial nations. This was a catalyst to a lot of the division, some of which we've already talked about in this lecture, during World War I within these nations, the way in which nationalism, patriotism began to fray a bit, particularly when the war went on so long, when it was so taxing and demanding, particularly on the poor, who were the ones being conscripted, drafted. Most nations involved in World War I relied on the draft, conscription, to force people to fight and die on the Western Front. It was a brutal, grisly, violent war, high casualty rates. There's a good likelihood you're going to die. You're going to lose an arm and leg. And as a result, in many of these nations, a class consciousness developed, a sense that this was a war that profited the rich, these industrialists who controlled these industries, and ultimately the burdens of the war were borne by poor soldiers and working class citizens of these nations. So we noted that internal divisions was one of the causes of World War I, and there was this great hope that a big rousing victory through war against a common enemy would quiet that discontent and smooth over those divisions. It doesn't exactly work out that way because World War I went on for so long, 4 years. It was so difficult and trying and taxing on civilian populations, while other segments of these populations, industrialists, profited immensely. And so actually, after World War I, you see greater dissent, greater divisions in these nations because of the way in which some greatly profited, while others seem to again disproportionately bear the brunt of the miseries of the war. Related to this is again a transition in these industrial economies to increasingly an economy focused on manufacturing, and with it the further decline of what used to be the power class in these nations, the landed elite, the landed aristocracy. Again, this really brings together a lot of what we've talked about at this point in the class, how in these nations involved in World War I, in the 18th and 19th century, you see the Industrial Revolution, you see a liberal revolution in many of these nation states, and a lot of that was driven by a sense of change with a new economy, the efforts of industrialists who see themselves as the new leaders, the rightful leaders of these nations, rejecting the power and privilege and customs and traditions that concentrated power in the hands of aristocrats who owed their power either through bloodline and tradition or their control of land. Well, land means less in an industrial economy. Land is less important when your economy is transitioning towards industrialization. Instead, profit comes from owning factories, owning railroads, not owning big estates. And so you see the further decline of what already began with industrialization and the rise of liberalism, this rejection of an old order, as these economies increasingly center on manufacturing and industrialization in a war that really demanded mass production of not just munitions and war implements, but all the other things necessary to sustain a society and economy in a time of scarcity, in a time of war. So I've already noted that the great hope of World War I to quiet discontent, quiet divisions within these nations would fail to materialize. Instead, as the war went on for so long, a class consciousness develops in many of these nations, and we'll talk about some of the consequences of that in lectures to come as we examine key events after World War I. But because of this growing divide between industrialists and workers that the war deepened, an already existing divide, there was a hope that through greater recognition and prominence of labor unions, maybe some of that disquiet and discontent could be assuaged. And so you see in many of the nations involved in World War I, certainly here in the United States, a greater regularization and acceptance of labor unions by industrialists who tended to war against labor unions in the late 19th and early 20th century before the war. As I mentioned in our most recent lecture on the cause of World War I, this was a time in the industrial world in the late 19th, early 20th century, in the run-up to World War I, as that long fuse burned, of great militancy, great clashes between industrialists and labor unions. There were efforts to stop labor unions by the wealthy industrialists of these nations. But in World War I, to try to quiet discontent and most importantly get people to show up to make the bombs, bullets, and boots necessary for the war, there was a deliberate effort in many of the nations involved in the war to put aside that hostility and antagonism with labor unions and work with them, recognize them, regularize them, because industrialists realized it's not good to have disquiet, discontent, and divisions between working people and industrialists when you need to win a war. You need those people to show up to make the bombs, bullets, and boots necessary for the war. And furthermore, such divisions over wages and working conditions not only undermine the war, but they shatter the confidence, the unity, the patriotism that's necessary for the war. The war itself was exacting demands upon a civilian population. The war itself challenged people's commitment to the nation, to patriotism when the war went on for so long. The last thing the power brokers, the politicians and industrialists want in these nations is further strife, further division, further ways of undermining that unity. And so one way to quiet discontent as it continued in World War I was to work with labor unions, to recognize them, to establish somewhat friendlier relations between labor unions and industrialists and end the intense militancy that existed prior to the war. One of the key developments here within the United States in World War I, one of the key domestic impacts on the United States, who will enter the war in April of 1917 and continue in the war until its end in November of 1918, concern demography. And that is a massive migration of African Americans out of the South to northern cities, something that's known as the Great Migration. This is one of the most important signal events in American history in the 20th century, and it's largely triggered by the wartime economy during World War I. Between 1910 and 1920, a time period, a decade, most of it defined by World War I, which, though the United States doesn't get involved until 1917, as we learned in our first lecture, the war begins in 1914. So most of the 1910s was defined by World War I. And World War I had a huge impact on the American economy years prior to America entering the war in 1917. During that decade, 1910 to 1920, a decade so defined by World War I, 500,000 African Americans will leave southern states and make their way to Chicago, to Detroit, to New York, something known as the Great Migration. So this is a huge domestic impact in the United States. It has a huge impact on American history going forward. It represented the dreams and aspirations of African Americans to flee the states of the old Confederacy, to flee the rural South, to find opportunities for industrial employment in the North, where they hoped to find better working conditions, higher wages, and a reprieve from the bitter and intense racism that defined life in the South in the early 20th century. Sadly, tragically, for so many of the 500,000 African Americans who leave the South, hoping for higher wages, better working conditions, and a less racist America waiting for them in northern cities, that would not be the case. They faced job discrimination, where they were often unable to secure employment in those factories in the North during the wartime boom, during the wartime industry. They faced residential segregation. They were forbidden from moving and living in certain parts of these northern cities. Racism in the United States was not confined to the South. And again, you get a good dose of that in the biography of Jack Johnson that you're reading, where we see that he encountered racism wherever he went. It wasn't confined to his home state of Texas. It wasn't confined to the South. And massive race riots broke out throughout the United States as a result of this Great Migration. In East St. Louis in 1917, in Chicago in 1917. This is part of the way in which, again, World War I created a great deal of division and discontent within the nation as African Americans fled the rural South and made their way into these northern cities. Whites in these cities resented the arrival of African Americans, and they took to the streets and beat and killed African Americans for daring to move to what these whites saw as their city, for daring to vote in local elections, for daring to send their kids to local public schools. The Great Migration is responsible for deadly race riots around this country, including the deadliest race riot in American history, which took place in Tulsa, Oklahoma, of all places, after African Americans made their way to Tulsa during World War I, seeking jobs in the booming oil industry. Oil was one of those industries that boomed as a result of World War I. African Americans left the South and made their way to Tulsa. And as a result, there was a race riot in Tulsa when whites in Tulsa resented the arrival of these African Americans, and they took to the streets and they killed hundreds of African Americans in the Tulsa race riot. They burned the black section of the city to the ground. And the city of Tulsa had an airplane in 1921 when the Tulsa Race Massacre occurred. In 1921, an airplane was pretty rare, but the city of Tulsa had one. And they flew it over the black section of Tulsa and bombed the residents of that city. African Americans in Tulsa, Oklahoma, who had moved to that city hoping for a better life, were bombed by their own government. In World War I, no cities here in the United States were bombed. None of the fighting took place here. But in 1921, in the aftermath of World War I, as a result of this Great Migration, you had American citizens being bombed by their own government. Why? Because they're African Americans who dared to move to that city. Over 300 people were killed in the Tulsa Race Massacre. Over 10,000 were rendered homeless. So the Great Migration was itself a major event that took place within the United States as a result of World War I. And then, as a result of the Great Migration, America's racism baldly on display in a series of race riots that took place throughout the nation, including the deadliest race riot in American history, the Tulsa Race Riot of 1921. Many of the nations involved in World War I racked up massive debt in order to support the war and the war effort. After the war, these economies would be in ruins with massive inflation, particularly Germany, which we'll talk about here in this lecture, that was punished for its role in World War I, and that led to a great crisis in Germany, and so much will come out of that, as we'll see in lectures to come. In response to this, there's an effort to pay down debts, and that meant onerous taxes on the civilian populations of these nations who endured the miseries of World War I, and then endured the miseries that followed World War I with this time of economic instability. World War I will really rock the global economic order. It will set in motion events that will lead to the Great Depression, which is a global depression that will rock the global economy in the 1930s and lead to the rise of fascism in Europe and, in many ways, the onset of World War II. So, key consequences going forward to the economies of those nations involved. World War I was ruinous in every way. It took the lives of millions of people. It helped unleash a massive pandemic that would kill tens of millions of people on continents around the world. And then it ravaged and destroyed not just the bodies and lives of so many human beings, but the economies of those nations involved. And it will lead to great economic distress, economic chaos, with so many consequences to come. With men on the Western and Eastern Front fighting the war, World War I would be a great boon to feminism in nations involved in the war because women found greater opportunities, filling the void in the industrial economy left when men were not on the assembly lines in factories, but instead fighting and dying on the war front. Women entered the workforce in greater and greater numbers, and with it came a greater assertiveness by women as they sacrificed in the war effort. Certainly women sacrificed in the war effort itself. They were right there on the Western and Eastern Front. They were right there on the battlefield, serving as nurses in support capacities, challenging the fictions of sexism as they were exposed to the grisly, brutal realities of the war. But they were also sacrificing and serving on the home front in efforts like leading scrap drives, blood drives, and working in the workforce. And it's no coincidence that after the war, women who had sacrificed and served in this way, who had sacrificed and served for their nation, demanded greater equality, demanded greater opportunities to be recognized as full and equal citizens. It's no coincidence that here in the United States, soon after World War I, the 19th Amendment would be ratified, granting at least white women the right to vote. And that's because of the surging feminism that World War I amplified. Feminism was already a powerful, growing force in most of the nations involved in World War I prior to the war. But the demands of the war, the way in which women responded to those demands, the way in which women sacrificed and served for their nation, either as nurses on the battlefield, as support staff, or in the economy, allowed women after the war to demand greater prominence, greater equality, greater opportunities in these nations. So World War I was a great boost, a great boon to an already surging feminism in nations involved in the conflict, as women were so integral to the efforts of the war, sacrificing and serving in a variety of ways. Certainly, many women involved in World War I were committed to that chest-thumping, flag-waving patriotism. They saw themselves as equal members of that nation, whose nationalism was deepened and massaged by the war, and that meant after the war they wanted to be recognized as full and equal members of that nation. And so this was a moment for greater ascendance of women as participants in this great national struggle, and as a result, a moment for greater ascendance of feminism in so many of the nations involved in the conflict. Another domestic impact of World War I was the way in which these nations involved, now during a long and difficult war, would marshal modern media in new ways in propaganda designed to convince the civilians, the citizens of their nation, that this was a great, noble, patriotic effort. In the early 20th century, new forms of technology are developed that allow ideas and messages to spread, influence, and infect in ways never seen before. A lot of what we'll focus on in this class, which examines the history of the 20th century, new modern media that's developed in the 20th century. Things like print media, film, radio later, television, and now the internet. The history of the 20th century, in many ways, is the history of new forms of modern media. And in World War I, in here, the now second decade of the 20th century, a lot of this new media was available to the nations involved in this conflict. And governments in these nations will harness that modern media and use it to spread propaganda. Propaganda that in some instances was designed to build that sense of nationalism, patriotism. Nationalism is learned, as we stressed. It's that process of urging you to learn to see yourself as part of a community, to imagine connections. And as it is learned, it has to be constantly fostered and fed. It doesn't just take place once and you're an American. You have to constantly reimagine those connections. And so World War I was a chance for governments through propaganda to deepen, foster, and continually feed that sense of us. And that was very important, particularly as the war went on so long and the sacrifices were so manifold and demanding. But another thrust of the propaganda that you see in World War I was to establish a sense of us also through forms of exclusion. Remember, as we stress in this class, seemingly in every slide, certainly in every lecture, human beings in the modern age go through this process of inclusion, which is tied to a process of exclusion. We're the great German people, we're the great Filipino people, we're the great Cuban people. And we know that because we have these commonalities, but we also know that because we're not one of them, right? There's this counterpoint, this point of distinction that's key to building identity. And a lot of the propaganda involved in World War I not only sought to massage and deepen patriotism by emphasizing commonality, these are the things that define us, the great British, French, American people, but also by condemning others, by condemning the enemies of the nation, the obvious enemies on the other side of the war, but also enemies within the nation. And so propaganda very much indicative of the domestic impact of the war, and also very indicative of the big macro themes that we encounter in this class as a good example of using modern media, using new techniques and means of persuasion to advance this idea of inclusion and exclusion. Let's use as a case study of that final domestic impact, propaganda, the Committee on Public Information, the CPI, which was created here in the United States when the United States entered the war in April of 1917. In April of 1917, the American president, Woodrow Wilson, would go to Congress and urge Congress to declare war against the Central Powers to, quote, make the world safe for democracy, and the U.S. Congress followed suit. So in April of 1917, the U.S. was now involved in this conflict. In that same month, the U.S. government creates the CPI, the Committee on Public Information, which was tasked with convincing the American people to see the war as a good, noble, patriotic effort. It was headed by George Creel, who prior to being appointed the head of the CPI had made his career in yellow journalism, a style of tabloid journalism that prevailed not just in the United States but in many of these industrial nations in the late 19th century. Yellow journalism was in many ways the origin of today's tabloid journalism. It in many ways is the origin of things like National Enquirer or TMZ or the clickbait articles that are always trying to get you to click on them on the web today. The style of journalism known as yellow journalism was sensationalistic. It trafficked in stories of violence, of sex and intrigue. And George Creel, prior to becoming the head of the CPI, was very active in establishing that mode of journalism that helped sell a lot of newspapers and sell the American people on certain beliefs. Creel was now appointed to the CPI, and he brought those talents now to the effort of trying to urge the American people to see the war as good, noble, patriotic, and rally the American people around this effort as it now entered World War I. And the CPI meant now that your government, in your name, with your taxpayer money, is in the propaganda business. This is really revelatory of what happens in nations like the United States, in the nations involved in World War I, where their government is now assuming a new role. Prior to the CPI, these techniques of persuasion were done by private profiteers, men like William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, to sell newspapers. But now these techniques of persuasion are being done by the government, and doing so to convince you of a political point of view. This is what happens in the United States. This is what happens in many of the nations involved in World War I, this consolidation of power through propaganda by the government. The CPI used all sorts of new techniques of persuasion, mass publication of printed materials as they printed, published, and distributed 75 million pamphlets. They ran ads in magazines and newspapers. They put up posters. The famous Uncle Sam poster that you've likely seen, "I Want You," was created by the CPI as a recruitment effort. What did Uncle Sam want you to do? Well, join the army. Sacrifice, serve on the Western Front. The CPI even made movies. This is very demonstrative of how new modern media was being used in new ways, in this case by the government of the United States. Cinema, motion pictures, still a pretty new technology in 1917. Many Americans, many people around the world had not seen a film in 1917, but with the CPI here in the United States, this new means of communication, of persuasion, this new modern miracle of cinema was being used by the government to persuade you of a certain political point of view. And so the CPI made movies. When you went to go see a movie in the United States in 1917, 1918, during the war years, before you settled in to see the main feature attraction, you'd see a newsreel, a short, and a short film produced by the CPI. So they printed pamphlets, they ran ads, they produced posters, they even dispatched 4-minute men around the country. Now, no guy wants to be known as a 4-minute man, but this had nothing to do with their performance in the bedroom. A 4-minute man was a guy who would stand up at boxing matches, wrestling matches, movie theaters, baseball stadiums, and give a 4-minute lecture on why you should support the war. So you're settling in for an evening entertainment at a baseball game, a boxing match, and all of a sudden a guy stands up and yells at you for 4 minutes. And he was paid to do that by the government. So this is a case study indeed of what takes place in most of the nations involved in the war, where they were now using these new techniques of persuasion to spread propaganda designed to convince their citizens to support the war and rally around the flag, trust their leaders, and see the other side as evil, as worthy of this effort to defeat them. In the United States, it manifests in the CPI, which really had two major thrusts, two major emphases. One was about U.S. nationalism. It stressed this idea of America as a beacon of freedom, a beacon of hope. It was, again, this process of nationalism, learning to imagine yourself as part of a community with a common body of ideals. We are the American people. This is who we are. A nation in dialogue with itself, telling itself who it truly is. You see that with the CPI. You see that with this propaganda, as the CPI often represented America as this beacon of freedom and democracy in contradistinction to the other. This is who we're not. The CPI represented Germany, America's enemy now, in World War I, as ruled by a Kaiser, a tyrant. So this was a chance to say, this is who we are. We're America. We're a beacon of democracy. Remember, Woodrow Wilson, the American president, said we're fighting this war to make the world safe for democracy, and then also to remind Americans of who they're not. We're not like Germany, which is ruled by a tyrant. But the CPI wasn't just about fanning the flames of nationalism and patriotism. It was also a chance to condemn people within the nation who were recognized as not members of our community, as it also targeted war protesters. Another one of the domestic impacts of these wars was the development of a peace movement, an anti-war movement. And most of the nations involved in the war did have a strong and vigorous anti-war movement. A lot of this was driven by the economic inequities of the war. Many of the people who were active in the anti-war peace movement were members of labor unions or socialists who decried the way in which the war, again, was a war that aggrandized the wealth of industrialists, but led to the death of poor working class people on the Western Front. So there were anti-war movements, there were peace movements, and many of these propaganda efforts targeted them as enemies within. And that's certainly true of the CPI, which urged you to see the anti-war movement, the peace movement, as un-American, unpatriotic. And it also targeted German Americans and German immigrants as potential outsiders within. And many German Americans were subject to harassment during World War I, even though they were born here. If they were the children of immigrants under the 14th Amendment, they were citizens, and they should be equal as any other American. Many German immigrants who came were eager to serve in the war and prove their patriotism, and yet their government, the United States government, was often representing them as traitors or potential saboteurs within. And so a lot of German Americans were very much maligned and targeted as a result of this effort by the government that encouraged a very anti-German sensibility. Here in the United States, all things German were suspect in World War I. And that's why during World War I, the hamburger in the United States was renamed the Liberty Sandwich. Set aside the fact that the hamburger was actually invented in America. There's nothing more American than a hamburger. But because the first few letters in that sandwich spell out a city in Germany, we can't call it that. So they renamed the hamburger the Liberty Sandwich. Sauerkraut was renamed Liberty Cabbage. Now, I know this seems strange and bizarre. Don't worry, nothing like this would ever occur today, where the Congress of the United States would actually allocate time during the day to pass a resolution renaming French fries freedom fries. No, nothing like that would ever occur today, of course. So yes, a lot of this is silly and ludicrous, but it demonstrates how, again, people within the nation, in this case German Americans, weren't safe from this process of othering and exclusion that came with these modern media techniques used now in the cause of propaganda. So one of the domestic impacts, your government in your name now in the propaganda business, telling you who you are and who among us is not worthy of being recognized as part of that community. So this, again, demonstrates the way in which World War I would change the nations involved in this conflict, even touching people who are never going to carry a rifle, never find themselves on the battlefield. People hundreds, thousands of miles away. It's another way of thinking about how World War I can be thought of as the first modern war, because it features these dramatic changes, these effects of now mass mobilization, things like propaganda, where as a result of this conflict, people who, again, aren't soldiers or sailors will have their lives transformed by, in this instance, the way in which their government is launching a propaganda effort. And so we're going to talk a lot about mass media. We're going to talk a lot about the new techniques of persuasion that exist in the 20th century and what they make possible, whether it is, in this case, World War I and propaganda, the way in which fascist dictators like Hitler will have their own film corps that will create propaganda for them as they rise and ascend in the aftermath of World War II. At the very end of the class, we'll talk about the Rwandan genocide of the 1990s and how radio was so instrumental to the mass killings that went along with it. So at the history of the 20th century, our subject in this class is the story of bloodshed, hardship, and misery. A lot of that bloodshed, hardship, and misery comes from this new technology, this new mass media that enters the human experience in the 20th century, and the CPI and propaganda in World War I, one beat in that longer rhythm. Here's a poster from the CPI. This gives you a flavor, a sense of what the posters were like. And it's a very telling and revealing poster because it represents the Germans as animals, as beasts. Propaganda was very important to building up American commitment to entering this war and prior to America's entrance, a lot of that propaganda was, again, the province of newspapermen trying to profit off the war, but it tended to represent the Germans as evil and bestial. And then when America enters the war, now the government of the United States was involved in that effort. And so you have this ape-like figure who is wearing this helmet synonymous with the German military with that spike there, represented in this way. And then to really hammer the point home, in his right hand you have this club with the German word Kultur. So here is the government of the United States producing this poster that represents the Germans as bestial, as ape-like. And in his clutches is a white woman representing Lady Liberty. So this German beast is a threat to liberty, to the American ideal of freedom. And at the very bottom, you could see this very open, bald effort to harness your outrage and anger, your way of seeing the Germans as evil and bestial and threats to liberty in an effort to get you to enlist in the U.S. Army. But there's another way of thinking about this poster, particularly in a very American context. Think about Jack Johnson, who, as an African-American man who dated and married white women, invited the backlash and wrath of racist whites who could not accept miscegenation, as it was described, could not accept these relations between an African-American man and white women. And if you think about the long history in the United States of representing African-Americans as apes, as monkeys, there's a way in which this image would connect with American racism in the age of Jack Johnson on that legacy and foundation of racism in a particularly American and unique way. So there's a lot here that we could use to analyze the significance and meanings behind this poster produced again by the U.S. government and the CPI during World War I. It wasn't just an anti-German statement. It was one built on a very strong foundation of racism within American culture and history. All right, now having spoken for some time about the domestic impact of World War I on the nations involved, let's transition and address the last topic we need to examine as we examine the World War I era, and that's the end of the war and the immediate aftermath. As I mentioned, in 1917, the war would shift as a result of some key developments in that year. There was an effort in 1918 to continue a commitment to absolute victory, but the fractures and divisions that the war elicited and advanced proved to be too much. And ultimately, in November of 1918, Germany would call for an armistice, which again is not a surrender. Germany does not surrender and say, you're kicking our ass, we can't fight anymore. They called for a cessation of the conflict, a laying down of arms, and a chance to hammer out a peace agreement that Germany and most nations involved would just doodaloo go back before all this crap happened. There's great hope that we could stop the war, hammer out a peace agreement, and go back before all this madness was unleashed. And so that's the story of the end of the war. As early as January of 1918, the American president, Woodrow Wilson, expressed what he hoped that post-World War I order would look like in a speech that outlined 14 points, 14 different ways of structuring a post-World War I order. Remember, Woodrow Wilson was a former college president, PhD, so it's no surprise that he had 14 points to share, not 3 or 4, 14. He was a professor, he was a PhD, and so he was going to go on and on and on about all the wonderful things, all the wonderful plans he had for making the post-World War I order one of peace and prosperity. Remember, he was an idealist who believed in reason, rationality as a former college president and PhD. And though the world had descended into war, though his own nation, the United States, had entered this war, he hoped that after World War I, we can make sure none of this happens again. And so he advanced these 14 points as his plan, as Woodrow Wilson's plan for the post-World War I order as the war was winding down in late 1917 and through 1918. I won't burden you with all 14 points, But here's a few examples of the 14 points that Wilson enunciated, his vision for a post-World War I order. He called for self-determination for people in Europe, tellingly. Remember that assassination of Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo by a Serbian nationalist was in many ways the spark, the explosion at the end of a long fuse that led to World War I. Remember, as we've talked a lot about in previous lectures, nationalism is a contagion around the world. People aspire to their own nation. And Wilson said, well, to prevent future conflicts, to prevent what happened to Franz Ferdinand and the way in which it led to war, let's make sure the people of Europe, at least, get a nation of their own. And we'll talk in a moment about how after World War I, there was an effort to create new nation states out of the big sprawling empires, the Russian Empire, the German Empire, to break up the Austrian-Hungarian Empire and give people within those big sprawling empires a nation of their own. And if we did that, if we gave self-determination to the people of Europe, well, that would lead to less violence, less divisions, reduce the assassinations and their consequences, and create, again, peace and order. So that was one element of Wilson's 14 points. If everyone had a nation of their own, we wouldn't have these conflicts over nationalism. Now, I stressed to you that he was talking about the people of Europe. Remember, in 1918, when the United States president, Woodrow Wilson, makes this argument, the United States had an empire. We controlled parts of Cuba. Woodrow Wilson invaded many Latin American nations. He set up an occupation of Haiti, the Dominican Republic. And so America had an empire, and we were not inclined to give the Haitians, the citizens of the Dominican Republic, the Philippines, which remained an American colony in 1918, self-determination. Self-determination was for white people in Europe, not for Africans, Asians, people in the British, French, German empires. So self-determination, this idea of assuaging people's demands for nationalism, was limited in Woodrow Wilson's vision to white people in Europe. Woodrow Wilson was a Southerner. He was born in the aftermath of the Civil War. He was one of the biggest racists ever to be president of the United States, and that's saying a lot in a nation where prior to the Civil War, all but two of our presidents were slave owners. And yet Woodrow Wilson may stand as one of the biggest racists in our history. And so his idea of self-determination was limited to the people of Europe. He called for freedom of the seas, free trade, and he gave a rhetorical concession to colonized people in Africa, Asia, Latin America by saying, well, we'll give you a little bit more say in internal events, but we're not ending the American empire, and I certainly don't imagine Great Britain, France is going to end their empire. So it was only rhetorical, only symbolic in his 14 points to grant any concessions for political voice and participation for colonized people. So that was Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson urged the American Congress to declare war on the Central Powers to, quote, make the world safe for democracy. And he really believed that through American intervention in World War I, America could play a decisive role in a post-World War I order that he hoped would bring peace and prosperity through these 14 points. However, Woodrow Wilson would run into the designs and intentions of Great Britain that had very different aspirations for a post-World War I order. One more point about Wilson and his idealism. In addition to his 14 points, he called for a League of Nations, an international body where the nations of the world could work out their problems. In many ways a precursor to the United Nations, which comes out, as we'll talk about later in the class, at the end of World War II and continues to this day. Woodrow Wilson, PhD, former college president, believed in reason, rationality, diplomacy, and he argued that if we had a League of Nations where people could get together and through reason, rationality, and diplomacy work out their disputes, well, we could stop future conflict. So in addition to his 14 points, he proposed this League of Nations. But that ambitious, idealistic vision of Wilson ran into, again, the designs of Great Britain and France, who weren't too interested in creating international harmony and reclaiming reason, rationality. Instead, France and Great Britain, at the end of World War I, wanted to seize this moment to cripple Germany, to weaken Germany, to secure their standing as the most powerful nations on earth. France and Great Britain feared Germany. Germany in the 19th century rapidly industrialized. Germany became a modern nation state as part of those revolutions that swept through Europe and created a new modern nation state with a new bureaucracy and liberal forms of governance. So Great Britain was ascendant in the late 19th and early 20th century, and France and Great Britain feared that this ascendant Germany would soon eclipse them and become the most powerful nation on earth. And so they wanted to seize this moment where Germany had called for an armistice to punish Germany, to foist 100% responsibility of the war onto Germany, to strip Germany of land, resources, to radically downscale its military so that Germany would not be a rival, that France and Great Britain could maintain their supremacy as the most powerful nations on earth. What they wanted to do was to blame Germany, cripple Germany, and do so in a way that would make sure that Germany would never be a threat ever again. Well, spoiler alert, it doesn't exactly work out that way. Instead, as we'll soon see in lectures to come, when Germany is forced to accept 100% responsibility for World War I, when it is saddled with onerous reparations, payments to France and Great Britain, it will destroy the German economy in the 1920s. It will create a sense of humiliation and despair that a veteran of World War I, a failed art student with a short mustache and one testicle, will tap into as he rises to power in Germany, promising to avenge the injustice at the end of the war and restore the glory and might of the German nation. Yes, what happened at the end of World War I, the ways in which France and Great Britain seek to cripple and humiliate Germany would lead to the rise of Hitler and the beginnings of a second global war. Many historians argue that World War I and World War II aren't separate wars. They're just one big long war with a halftime in between. And that's because the seeds of the rise of Hitler, the seeds of World War II in Europe, were sown in the aftermath of World War I, when France and Great Britain hoped to weaken and humiliate Germany, but instead set in motion a crisis in Germany that will lead to the rise of Hitler. Japan was involved in World War I. It was on the side of the Entente powers. It was an ally of Russia, of Great Britain, and France. Japan, too, was seeking to become a major global industrial power. Japan had, in a matter of decades, just a few decades, gone through a remarkable shift. An industrial revolution took place in Japan with breakneck speed, very abruptly. What it took 100 years to accomplish in the United States, Japan does in 30. It goes from a rural, feudal, agrarian nation to an industrial powerhouse in like 30 years. And with it, they build up their own big bitchin' military, and they aspire to be a global power. They entered World War I with that idea that by participating in this conflict, they will have a chance to assume a equal standing on the global stage with the great powers, United States, Great Britain, Germany, France. And so Japan enters World War I. It wars against German colonies in Asia. It sacrifices and serves in this effort and emerges on at least the official winning side of World War I, the Entente powers. Nobody wins World War I. But officially, Germany would be blamed for the war, and the Entente powers of Great Britain, France, Japan, United States would be declared the winners. So Japan was on the winning side, and they wanted to be recognized as equal members of this cadre of powerful nations. Now it was an industrial powerhouse, a military powerhouse. It had sacrificed and served in this effort. And so it would send a delegation to Paris in 1919 in the peace conference that would adjudicate the end of the war. So we began our study of the aftermath of the war with these clashing aspirations. The United States and its ambitious, idealistic leader, Woodrow Wilson, the very base and power-centered aspirations of France and Great Britain, and the aspirations of another industrial powerhouse that was involved in the war, Japan. However, also, there were dreams and aspirations around the globe among colonized people who hoped that in the rhetoric of self-determination, espoused by ideologues like Woodrow Wilson. In a moment where nationalism was this powerful force around the globe, that they could claim this moment to seek opportunity for themselves. And that's well represented in Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh was the leader of a nationalist movement in Vietnam. Vietnam was part of the French Empire in the early 20th century when World War I breaks out. But the Vietnamese, like people all over the globe, wanted a nation of their own. They wanted to be free of French imperialism. Ho Chi Minh was the leader of that effort, a Vietnam for the Vietnamese. And he would travel to Paris, the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, the capital of France, and try to make his argument for self-determination at a moment where, again, in the rhetoric of Woodrow Wilson, there was this expression that people deserve a nation of their own. Ho Chi Minh would seek an audience with the French and try to persuade them that his people, the Vietnamese people, like people around the world, deserved nationalism, deserved a nation of their own. So it wasn't just the great industrial powers that had hopes and aspirations when the war ended. Seeking his own vision of self-determination, independence, Ho Chi Minh in many ways represents the aspirations of colonized and conquered people around the globe. So, a number of visions and aspirations for a new global order in the aftermath of World War I. And all this comes to a head at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919. In 1919, the leaders of the nations involved in the war would meet in Paris to hammer out a treaty that would officially mark the end of this ruinous, terrible war. You would be hard-pressed to name any other event in the last 100 years that has had a greater impact on human history than the Paris Peace Conference. What happened in Paris 100 years ago still affects all of us to this very day. As I've already indicated, when we turn our attention soon to the rise of fascism, the rise of Hitler in Germany, the onset of World War II, that will make sense, those stories that await us, based on what you're now going to learn about the Paris Peace Conference. So it would later be responsible for the beginnings of World War II. We'll talk in the slide about many events after World War II that come out of the Paris Peace Conference, and many of the international conflicts that we face today in the 21st century all come out of this one event that took place in Paris in 1919. In 1919, you had the Paris Peace Conference, which at the time was designed to hammer out a peace agreement, write a treaty that would end the war. But this one event that occurs in Paris in 1919 would reverberate through the remainder of the 20th century, and we'll see many examples of that in lectures to come, and in many ways continue to define human life here in the 21st century. Some of the immediate impacts of the Paris Peace Conference, well, the treaty that was written, the Versailles Treaty to end World War I, was ultimately reflective of the designs and intentions of France and Great Britain that sought to force 100% of the responsibility for the war onto the shoulders of Germany. A war that was everyone's fault. Long fuse, many factors, contributions to that onset of the conflict. A war that had many authors. A war that was everyone's fault officially was blamed 100% on the Germans. And that was because Great Britain and France were hoping to again seize this moment to humiliate, punish, and weaken Germany. As part of the treaty that ended the war, Germany had to give up massive amounts of land. The German Empire was dismantled. And in some of the German Empire, new nations were created. Germany had to pay onerous reparations, millions and millions of dollars, to the official winners of the war. Nobody wins the war, but the official winners of the war, Great Britain and France, and that would decimate and destroy a German economy already reeling from the ruinous effects of the war, leading to an economic collapse and catastrophe in Germany. Germany would feel the sting of that in the years that follow, and that's why, in part, they will turn to a man who will say, I'll restore the might and power of the German nation, Adolf Hitler. Germany lost its colonies around the globe. It had to radically downscale its army and navy. as part of this effort to weaken Germany, to make sure Germany could not challenge, threaten France and Great Britain. Again, it doesn't work out that way, but at least that was the hope. And so that was one of the impacts of the Paris Peace Conference, the Versailles Treaty that ends the war. And it's one of the impacts that, again, will set in motion the rise of Hitler and the onset of World War II. Germany lost its colonies around the globe as part of this effort to, again, diminish its power and prestige around the world. Then, out of land claim from Germany, out of an effort to carve up the old Austrian-Hungarian Empire that had within it groups like the Serbs, out of land taken when Russia early exits the war. Russia would leave the war well before the end of the war and the Paris Peace Conference. New nations were created. One of the immediate impacts of the Paris Peace Conference was to rewrite the map of Europe. And all of a sudden, new nations that had never existed before are established. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Austria, and Hungary are now separated into two separate countries. And this was reflective of, again, this idea of a plan to prevent future conflicts. This was what Wilson was arguing. If everyone had their own nation, we would have never had World War I. We wouldn't have had the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. If everyone had their own nation, we wouldn't have future conflicts. So, like many of the events at the Paris Peace Conference, this was designed in a way to prevent future conflicts. But it had the opposite effect. When Hitler comes to power, these are the first places he invades. He says that it's part of our German homeland. The people there identify with us. And so rather than prevent future conflicts, these new nations created would literally become the geography, the territory upon which the next major global war will take place. Hitler will come to power, he'll invade Poland, Czechoslovakia. And so rather than have the effect of preventing future conflicts, this will instead become the very geography and terrain of World War II. A League of Nations, that was part of Wilson's great hope, an international body where the nations of the world could come together. And officially, the Versailles Treaty that ends World War I would create a League of Nations, and a League of Nations would be created, but ironically, one nation that never joined the League of Nations, Wilson's own United States of America. As part of the checks and balances of a liberal constitution, of the American Constitution, presidents can negotiate treaties, but the Senate has to ratify them. Wilson negotiates the Versailles Treaty, the Paris Peace Conference. He brings it back to the United States, presents it to the U.S. Senate for ratification. And a funny thing had happened in the United States over the course of 20 years, beginning with the Spanish-American War, continuing with the U.S.-Philippine War, invasions of Haiti, the Dominican Republic, a disastrous effort to involve the United States in the Mexican Revolution. More about that later in the class. And then America's entrance into World War I. By 1918, when World War I ends, America had been involved in an effort to march around the globe, fight wars of aggression, take colonies for 20 years, starting with the Spanish-American War in 1898. At the end of that 20-year period, the American people had war fatigue. They had enough. They questioned the efficacy of the war. We were told that we must enter this war, quote, to make the world safe for democracy. Well, at the end of the war, the world didn't look very safe, and it didn't look very democratic. War doesn't make the world better. It makes it worse. As we've enunciated in this lecture, World War I unsettled and changed America dramatically. Your government now in the propaganda business, the Great Migration, this huge influx of African Americans to northern cities, a rising feminist movement. People said, if this is what war brings, no thanks, I don't want war. After World War I, the American public would embrace isolationism. In the decades we'll soon talk about, the 1920s, 1930s, the decades that mark the rise of Hitler and the ramp up to World War II, the American people embraced isolationism. They said, problems of the world aren't our problems. We've got two big bitchin' oceans to protect us. We don't need to worry about events around the globe. Responding to that growing sense of war fatigue, questioning the efficacy of war, and isolationism, the U.S. Senate, senators refused to ratify the League of Nations. And the United States never joins it, weakening this institution. What was Woodrow Wilson's dream child, his own nation, rejected as isolationism would become the defining American foreign policy in the decades to come. I made a joke in our very first lecture on the World War I era about the Ottoman Empire. Sorry about that again. Hopefully you've recovered from that terrible joke. The Ottoman Empire was the sprawling empire in Southwest Asia, what you may refer to as the Middle East. And after World War I, at the Paris Peace Conference, it was carved up into what were called protectorates, which were basically colonies. What happens is that France and Great Britain take a map of the old Ottoman Empire, and they just draw lines. They start drawing lines on the map and say, you get that part, you get that part, that will be your protectorate, that will be your protectorate, meaning Great Britain and France will now control that region. In doing so, they wrote the map of the modern Middle East. This is a good example of how, as I began this slide, I said what happened at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919 so affects us today. The conflicts we have today in Southwest Asia, conflicts we'll talk about in one of our very last lectures in the course, all come out of what happened in Paris in 1919, because France and Great Britain draw lines on a map and say, you get that part, we'll take this protectorate, and they create fictions. They create things that do not exist, like Syria. There's no such thing as Syria. It was created arbitrarily by Europeans in Paris without consulting the people in that region. Iraq, that's a fiction. Iraq does not exist. When we, the United States, invaded Iraq in 2003, the American public was told they will greet us as liberators, they will throw roses at our feet. Well, that's not what happened. When we invaded Iraq in 2003, that country, if you can call it that, descended into civil war because the people in Iraq never ever thought of themselves all as Iraqis. And that's because of what happened in Paris in 1919. We've talked so much in these early lectures about nationalism. What began in the United States in the 1770s, where 13 colonies imagined themselves connected as one nation. What spread around the globe. Well, the people of the Middle East have been denied that. They've been denied it for 100 years. Because rather than have a chance to organically, on their own, forge those ties of affection and form their own nation, they were arbitrarily clustered together with people from different ethnic, linguistic, and religious backgrounds by the arbitrary drawings on the map that occurred in Paris in 1919. Great Britain and France draw these lines on the map and they create these fictions. They impose them on these people. The people of the Middle East have been denied self-determination for 100 years because of, again, this event that marks the carving up of an old Ottoman Empire and the creation of these new, first protectorates and later nations that were designed in Paris by French and British diplomats, without consulting the people on the ground who were denied a chance to organically on their own create a nation. And that's why we have civil war and strife in these regions. There's a civil war right now in Syria because the people in that polity don't identify as one people. They fracture, much like Iraq did after 2003, into civil war because of different ethnic, linguistic, and religious groups who have never had a chance to congeal as one community. So often in American media today, we are urged to see the conflicts in the Middle East as the responsibility of those people in that region who are always warring against each other. It's all about religion. Bullshit. It's not because those people are inherently biologically captious, quarrelsome, inclined towards violence. It's not often really about religion or the divisions that come from a faith. They're instead divisions that come from impositions, from a legacy of colonialism that was perpetuated here at the Paris Peace Conference. So the conflicts we see today in Iraq, in Syria, and parts of Southwest Asia are a direct result of the Paris Peace Conference and the imposition by Europeans upon those people, the effort to deny them self-determination. A good example of how, again, what happened in Paris in 1919 so affects everyone listening to this lecture today in the 21st century. Previous slide, I know that Japan had hoped to come to Paris as an equal, to have an equal seat at the table, to be recognized as a major industrial powerhouse. But they were shut out of the negotiations. They were denied a seat at the table, though they were on the winning side officially and had sacrificed and served in the war effort. And that's because of racism. and in particular the racism of an American president, Woodrow Wilson, who, as I said earlier, is arguably one of the biggest racists ever to occupy that office. The white European powers, the white American president, refused to have Japan sit at the same table because they were seen as inferior. Social Darwinism, racism, the world that Jack Johnson inhabits, the world that millions of people, Japanese, African Americans, Filipinos, so many of the groups he talked about, who are recognized not as equals, but instead condemned to being seen as inferior. Well, Japan was shut out as a result. Well, Japan doesn't take this slight easily. It doesn't take this insult, this racism, with a shrug. It goes back to Japan and continues to build up their economy and industry, and will soon rival once again for global supremacy. Will attack the United States, never forgetting the insult meted out by an American president. We've already talked in these two slides about how what happened at the end of World War I would sow the seeds of World War II in Europe, but guess what, history fans? It would also sow the seeds of World War II in Asia as a result of this insult meted out to the Japanese delegation. Ho Chi Minh? Well, he again went to Paris, speaking for the hopes of the Vietnamese people, but he too was rebuffed and ignored. France wasn't willingly going to dismantle its empire. Self-determination, so powerful, a watchword active in this Paris Peace Conference, was for white people in Europe, not for Filipinos, not for Algerians, not for Vietnamese citizens. But Ho Chi Minh didn't take that insult and slight easily. He went back and continued his war against the French. When, as we'll talk about soon, that part of Southeast Asia is invaded by Japan during World War II as it aspires to global supremacy. Ho Chi Minh will fight against the Japanese, still fighting against colonialism, now at the hands of the Japanese, in his quest for independence. After World War II, France will leave, but then the United States pours into Vietnam in an event we'll soon talk a great deal about after our first exam in the second part of the class. So here you have History 20. All of this comes out of this one event in Paris. Not just the origins of World War II, not just the origins of contemporary conflicts in the Middle East, but another major event of the 20th century, one we'll talk a lot about, one that likely affects many of the people listening to this lecture right now here in Southern California in the 21st century. The American War in Vietnam also owes its origins to what happened in Paris. Again, you'd be hard-pressed to name any other event in the early 20th century, maybe the 20th century in its totality, that has had a greater impact on humanity than what happened in Paris in 1919. All of this was encompassed in the Versailles Treaty, named after the Palace of Versailles, where the event, the Paris Peace Conference, was held. And hopefully, as you can see, whether it was this effort to punish and humiliate Germany, whether it was to deny so many self-determination while granting it to others, whether it was the racism that led to the shutting out of Japan, or the unwillingness to concede Ho Chi Minh's aspirations, Versailles Treaty should be seen as a shameful end to a shameful war, a shameful end to a very shameful moment in human history. Here is that new map of Europe after World War I, and you could see new nations. Compare this map to the map we had in our first lecture with the Central Powers against the Entente Powers, and this map looks very different with new nations: Poland, Czechoslovakia, Austria and Hungary now separate, no longer. There's no Austrian-Hungarian Empire anymore. That old aristocratic order toppled here. But as I said, so many of these nations will be the nations invaded by Germany as it seeks to win back its land, its prominence. Russia lost a great deal of land as part of its early exit as a result of the event we'll talk about in our next lecture, the Russian Revolution. But here is part of the effects of the Versailles Treaty and the Paris Peace Conference visually for you in a map with a cautionary note that we're soon to revisit this part of the world as the literal terrain upon which the next major global conflict will play out in World War II. Here is a map of the Middle East or Southwest Asia after World War I with these different mandates, protectorates. And as I've indicated, we'll talk about this part of the world later in the class and examine the modern Middle East and how so many of the events after World War II come out of the system established, this arbitrary effort to draw lines on a map and cluster people together. I've indicated that, if you want to understand contemporary conflicts in this region, it doesn't start with religion and tribal animosity. It starts with modern human history and colonialism and the Paris Peace Conference. But also we'll talk later in the class about the establishment of the modern nation state of Israel after the Holocaust and World War II. And the ability of Great Britain to control that land and in part aid in that effort to create Israel, another major event in 20th century history, also comes out of this as Great Britain would make its claims to that region and in doing so be in a position to help create the modern nation state of Israel after World War II. So again, we're doing a lot of foreshadowing here. So much comes out of the aftermath of World War I, including the modern map of the Middle East. One nation involved in so much of World War I wasn't present at the Paris Peace Conference, and that was, of course, Russia. As we'll talk about in our next lecture, a revolution breaks out in Russia during World War I. It will lead to the assassination of the Tsar and his family, the literal execution of the old traditional society ruled by an autocrat, and the creation of a new modern nation state, albeit one formed in relation to not liberalism, but a version of that democratic society ideology, namely communism. But the question of Russia loomed over the Paris Peace Conference, even if Russia wasn't there, because with the creation of a new Russia, formed out of a bloody revolution that executed the old aristocratic order. It wasn't just the Tsar and his family who were killed by the Bolsheviks. It was the landed elite. It was many of the power brokers and an ideology that targeted wealthy industrialists and the haves. The question of Russia loomed over these wealthy industrial modern nation states at the Paris Peace Conference as a looming threat. And there's this great fear that what happened there could happen in France, particularly with all that internal dissent and division that the war wrought. Russia represented a new way of organizing humanity. It's one of the big macro themes that we talked about in this class. How best to organize humanity? What is the dream, aspiration, goal of human governance? Well, this was a new answer to that question, communism, which was a great threat to the industrial capitalist order, a great threat to the empires, the British and French Empire, predicated in many ways on that industrial capitalist order. And so this, too, was one of the factors that influenced the end of World War I. At the end of World War I, the major industrial powers, France, Great Britain, United States, would be determined to crush the Soviet Union, the nation that emerges out of the Russian Revolution, as it was seen as such a threat, communist, anti-imperialist, a different way of organizing humanity predicated on this idea of a bottom-up revolution, democracy as the antithesis of liberalism, interpreted as what could happen when the mob rises up. So though Russia wasn't at the Paris Peace Conference, it loomed. And it influenced, in many ways, the aftermath of the war as these wealthy industrial capitalist nations, Great Britain, France, and the United States, even with America's commitment to isolationism, would be determined to extinguish what was seen as a gathering, growing menace, a fear that if it could happen there, it could happen everywhere. One of the hidden wars in American history, I've already talked about one, the U.S.-Philippine War. That's a war that few Americans know much about, but it's very revelatory as part of, again, a macro story of imperialism in the late 19th, early 20th century, as well as the story of the rise of the American Empire. So a little-known war that actually is very illustrative, the U.S.-Philippine War. But another, perhaps even more obscure war in American history is the war the United States would engage with against the Soviet Union in the aftermath of World War I, when there was an effort to restore the monarchy. The United States would involve itself in the Russian Civil War, an effort by Russians to reestablish the monarchy and roll back the Russian Revolution led by Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks. Russian Civil War was a battle between the whites and the reds. The whites being those advocating for rolling back the revolution, counter-revolutionary efforts, and an effort to reestablish the monarchy, extinguish this threat of a communist state that was anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, at least in rhetoric. The United States wanted to crush the Russian Revolution, roll it back, and so we aided the whites in their effort against the Reds, the army of Lenin and the Bolsheviks. And so American soldiers and American war efforts were involved in this effort. It's, again, one of the hidden wars in American history, but it's demonstrative of, again, how the United States and other industrial capitalist nations saw Russia as a threat, communist. The manifestation of the fears of industrialists, of this rising up of the mob, a different way of organizing humanity along the ideology of communism. So Russia wasn't at the Paris Peace Conference, but my, its presence loomed, and its presence now on the global stage as an alternative way of organizing humanity would lead to efforts to undermine the Soviet Union, would lead to the United States involved in this conflict, the Russian Civil War, siding with the whites against the Reds. The whites, again, the counter-revolutionary force, the effort to reestablish the monarchy. Red and white, it's Russian dressing, I guess, right? But in this case, it's an effort to, again, define what Russia will be after World War I. The United States wanted to influence that, even in its isolationist spirit, and involved itself in this way. And lectures will talk about how the 20s, 30s, and then certainly the aftermath of World War II was so influenced by the establishment of a communist state through the end of World War I. We are soon to talk about Red Scares, the Cold War, so many key events like the American War in Vietnam. And all that, of course, comes out of the response, the reaction to the establishment of the Soviet Union at the end of World War I, that alternative way of organizing humanity that industrial nations like the United States, capitalist nations like the United States, will see as a threat. So let's summarize everything we've talked about here before we tack and go forward to events after World War I, and lectures to come. We'll talk about Russian Revolution, global depression, and the onset of World War II. But before we get there, let's just recapitulate what we've learned in these two lectures. In our first lecture, we talked about the causes of the war, and there are many of them: nationalism, imperialism, industrialization, internal dissent. The course of the war, also described in that first lecture: brutal, violent, a stalemate, a meat grinder, pivot points in 1917. Here in this lecture, we talk about the domestic impact, the aggrandizement of power by industrialists, the executive branch of the nations involved in the conflict, propaganda employed in new ways through new modern media, rising feminism, decline of an older order represented by the landed elite, and the ascendance of an industrial class, further propelling those trends that predate World War I. And we spent a lot of time here in the latter part of this lecture talking about the Paris Peace Conference and the unsteady, uneasy, now global order that prevailed in the aftermath of World War I, where that hope for a now peaceful world would soon be shattered. Remember, Woodrow Wilson said the United States must enter this war to make the world safe for democracy. Well, at the end of the war, the world didn't look very safe and didn't look very democratic. And so heavy foreshadowing here, because we're soon to see that play out in tangible ways with the onset of World War II and then the conflicts that come from it. So much for safer democracy. And also remember, another one of the aftermaths of World War I was the sense of science, reason, technology now as forces for ill, forces for destruction, shattering that faith in science and technology among so many. Historians refer to this as the Lost Utopia. Utopia is a word in the English language to describe a perfect world, and for many, when the 20th century, our subject in this class, began, a new age of railroads and vaccines and automobiles and motion picture, photography, telephones, A perfect world, a utopia, seemed to be possible. And then came World War I, which would shatter that faith, revealing to humanity what was possible when science and technology were harnessed by human beings. And so that sense of a lost utopia, shattering of faith and optimism and hope, also key here to the aftermath of World War I, when for the remainder of the century and for the remainder of the class, we'll just see one man-made disaster after another. World War II, Cold War, nuclear destruction, genocide. Yeah, that's all that awaits us, history fans, in the weeks ahead. And with it, the end of World War I and its sense of a lost utopia, humanity would now have to countenance all of those developments that await us, that do indeed demonstrate how the 20th century, rather than be a chance for a perfect world, would lead to many, many dystopias.